Honestly, it's pretty difficult to talk about the instruments of Greek society without talking about Greek mythology. As you know, the Greeks had a pretty good pantheon of myths, and much of the Greek mythology features music. And while these myths are mostly made-up tales, the way they speak about music and musicians can tell us a lot about music at the time. So, Apollos was the god of music and harmony, but many of the muses were said to be responsible for certain aspect of music. The term music itself means from the muses, or made by the muses. There's one particular story about Apollos, a god who played the lyre, where Marsyas, a half-man, half-animal, played the aulos. These two had a competition to see who is better at his instrument. Apollos won. But where this myth actually affects the culture is that this myth contributed to how those two instruments were seen in society, one of them being associated with good music and the other associated with bad. The lyre being the instrument of a god, and the aulos being the instrument of a half-man, half-animal. It's mentioned as such by Plato in his Republic. For some reason, there's just a whole bunch of information in mythology about Apollos' lyre. For example, it was made by Hermes on the day he was born. So, on the day that Hermes was born, he stole Apollos' cattle. As one does. He also made a lyre out of tortoiseshell. Not content to just sit in his hospital crib. No, Hermes is meant for much more than that. Naturally, Apollos is mad that Hermes has stolen his cows. Wouldn't you be? But everything was fine when Hermes gave Apollo the lyre. I, too, would no longer be mad about my cows if someone gave me a very nice instrument. The next logical thing, of course, is that Hermes becomes the keeper of the cows, while Apollos becomes a world-class lyrist. Lyrist. Hey Siri, what do you call a lyre player? Okay, so it's a lyrist? Not to be confused with lyricist. Then there's Orpheus. Orpheus was a gifted musician and lyre player. When his wife Eurydice died, he went to Hades and sang so beautifully that Hades let him return from the underworld with his wife, on the condition that he didn't look at her until they were out of the underworld. Seems a little arbitrary. He couldn't do it, and Eurydice vanished forever. So many of these Greek myths are just super depressing. But I bet this one could probably work as a Broadway musical. Music was also a regular feature in Greek literature. One book that I read for this project was literally just a list of every time that music was mentioned in Greek literature, such as the Odyssey. First you will come to the sirens who enchant all who come near them. If anyone unwarily draws in too close and hears the singing of the sirens, his wife and his children will never welcome him home again. For they sit in a green field and warble him to death with the sweetness of their song. There is a great heap of dead men's bones lying all around, with the flesh still rotting off of them. Therefore, pass these sirens by. Failure to pass the sirens by may result in your friends briefly thinking that you've been turned into a toad. Oh, come on, you didn't really think I was going to get through a section talking about the Odyssey without mentioning our brother Woerther. There are many references to singing and dancing in the Odyssey, all of which follow the same pattern of eating, drinking, and being married, followed by singing and dancing. One instance even says that it was the muses who roused them to singing and dancing. For the purposes of this video, I've split topics such as mythology and music education, theory, performance, and philosophy into different sections. But in reality, these topics were all very interconnected to the ancient Greeks, and it's difficult to find a boundary between them. Some of the most influential philosophers, such as Plato and Aristotle, had very strong opinions on music education and music theory, while being at least somewhat influenced by Greek mythology and the surrounding culture. So you can see where the lines get a little fuzzy. Music had an impact not only on the mind and the body, but also on the soul. This was considered common knowledge in Greek society. Socrates assigned gymnastics for the development of the body and music for the development of the soul. Music education, therefore, was for the training of the person, not the occupation. Rhythms and harmonies imitate ethical, human, and societal behaviors. Music considers the relationship between quantities, specifically the ratios that make up melodies and harmonies. It was for that reason that music was included in the quadrivium, the four mathematical sciences of the Greek education, including mathematics, music, geometry, and astronomy.
Music was part of the big four core subjects, so you have to think of music from a different perspective. It was in the same camp as arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. Music can be approached logically and mathematically as you study harmony and form.
Quoting from the 5th century philosopher Proclus, the Pythagoreans considered all mathematical science to be divided into four parts. One half they marked off as concerned with quantity, the other half with magnitude, and each of these they posited as twofold. A quantity can be considered in regard to its character by itself, or in its relation to another quantity, magnitudes as either stationary or in motion. Arithmetic, then, studies quantities as such, music the relationship between quantity, geometry magnitude at rest, and spherics, or astronomy, the magnitude inherently moving. The concept of these four subjects being related was still being considered in the 17th century by Johannes Kepler in his book The Harmony of the Worlds.
If you wanted to compare and contrast music education from the Greeks and music education with today's Western cultures, the biggest difference is why. For the Greeks, music was part of the whole body of thought. It was scientific, it was mathematical, it was aesthetically pleasing, it was beautiful, and it was part of the whole person. You can see how music could potentially be part of the whole person in today's music education climate. But really, today it's about learning to play an instrument, composing a piece of music, adding something for entertainment and enjoyment value. We do it because it's pretty and entertaining. They did it because it made them better people.
For Aristotle, music was even more important than just its role in mathematics or its role in shaping character. To him, music was inherent in both humanity and in social life. Music is education and pleasurable and intellectual and joy, all at the same time. Plato's Republic spells out quite a few thoughts on music, not only philosophy, but also education, theory, and practice. Musical training is a more potent instrument than any other because rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul, on which they mightily fasten, imparting grace and making the soul of him who is rightly educated graceful, or of him who is ill-educated ungraceful. And again, isn't the training in music of overriding importance, because rhythm and harmony penetrate most deeply into the recesses of the soul and take powerful hold on it, bringing gracefulness and making a man graceful if he is trained correctly, but the opposite if he is not. Music, he considered, was the most powerful educational tool because of the effects of melody and harmony on the young soul. In other words, good music would lead to desirable traits, where bad music would lead to undesirable traits. Chinese philosophers thought very similarly. And in writing the script for this section, it has become increasingly obvious to me that philosophy deserves its own video, especially comparing and contrasting Eastern and Western philosophies on music. Speaking of having a lot to unpack, Greek music theory. Of course, I'm a little biased towards music theory, and so I've had a lot to unpack to figure out what is actually necessary for this episode and what is not. That being said, plenty of treatises were written on the concept of music theory, and I've made other videos explaining specific topics in Greek music theory. One of the fundamental aspects of Greek music theory, as noted by the theorist Aristoxenus, was the concept of the tetrachord, four notes that were separated by a perfect fourth. The outer notes were considered unchangeable, considered boundary notes, and the inner notes that could change were considered passing notes. The change of the inner notes created different genera of tetrachord, of which there were three: diatonic, chromatic, and enharmonic. If we put a few of these tetrachords together, then we create a greater perfect system. The Aeolian harmony was more popular because of its consistency and unity, namely that it landed on every octave and established an absolute tonic, which was lacking in the other two, which led to their decline. In a similar manner, the diatonic genus became common, while the enharmonic and chromatic were considered archaic or academic in nature. You can see more on that system in this video here. But another important concept in his treatise is the relationship of sound. A sound is only musical in relation to another musical sound. C isn't music, but the relationship between C and another note is musical. Perhaps you can't recognize a single note being played, but if you heard a melody, no matter what key that melody was in, you would recognize it as that melody. Context is what gave that musical meaning. Without context, there is no meaning. So in summary, music is music, but only if other music is also music. That was a big part of Pythagorean thought. There were a lot of stories about Pythagoras, a lot of them apocryphal, some of them approaching the level of mythical, but whether the story of anvils and hammers and monochords are true, the concepts that come from these stories are important to both Greek and Western musical thought. Pythagoras realized that intervals could be made using whole number ratios. The smaller the ratio, the more perfect the interval. 2 to 1 is an octave, 3 to 2 is a perfect fifth, 4 to 3 is a perfect fourth, 28 to 27 is the septimal third tone, but it's also the score of the 2010 Iron Bowl. All of this lines up with the partials in the overtone series, and again, I have videos on all of these. The concepts in Greek music theory would go on to form the basis of much of Western music going forward. That's true for the thoughts on Greek music performance, music education, and music philosophy as well. but there's a few important things to note in conclusion. 1. The Greeks weren't the inventors of music. In fact, many of their ideas probably came from a variety of places. They had extensive trade with Egypt. This not only included the trade of goods and services, but also of knowledge and ideas as well. Also remember that Athens had mathematicians and philosophers coming from all over the place to learn and discuss and debate new ideas. This likely means that all Platonic and Pythagorean ideas on philosophy and mathematics were a conglomeration of ideas from different mathematicians and philosophers. It's easy to give more credit than we should to the thinkers who authored the books that bear their names, but no musician, no philosopher, no mathematician lives in a vacuum. How could they? There's no air. Furthermore, a lot of the ideas coming out in the Greek classical period had been happening in China for a few centuries. Concepts like the ratio of 3 to 2 being a perfect fifth, or the circle of fifths, or that music education is good for the soul. Number 2, much like the other cultures that we have studied so far, the music that has remained is the work of the free, often rich, and predominantly male. Music was being made by women, children, foreigners, and slaves, but they were forced to make the music that the elite demanded. They were not afforded the ability to compete in these musical competitions, nor could they rise to join the ranks of the academics who were discussing musical ideas and writing musical treatises. This is clearly seen within the symposiums. Greek elites would gather to talk about the intellectual topics of the day, including music. While their discussions would be considered of great value to both society and culture, the music that was being performed by slaves and hired musicians behind them amounted to nothing more than background noise. Number 3. Just because Greek music became the basis for Western music does not make it the gold standard. That statement extends to all Western music as well. Just because the system is 2,500 years old, and just because some Frankish monks in the 9th century used Greek names to name their scales, and just because the classical period had some weird obsession with how perfect everything in Greece was, that doesn't mean that it's the way that music should be done, or that it's the best music. Remember, the system has also created some really bad music across the years. And I'll let you fill in those blanks. All of this is not to say that music in Greece was not good or it wasn't valuable. Of course it was. All music is to some respect. But it's important to put it in the proper perspective and context along with the rest of world music history. Thanks for watching this episode of Music and History. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. And if you like this video, please share it with your friends. Also be sure to follow @2MinuteMusic on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you're a musicologist who'd like to collaborate, please send me a direct message. I'd love to work with you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.